So we're at Golden Doves class 223. We're on page 133. The oral law. We were talking about the people of the book versus the library of Babel. The library of Babel, Asot Sefanim Arbe and Kesef Shlomo HaMelech says, people of the book is the people who have a definite book, and all truth is a derivative of the book or is relative to the book. So continuing, the oral law. So because before we had the book in terms of the written book, the Tanakh, right? Now we have the oral law. The oral law is grounded in the irreducible tension between the oraculum and articulation. So we know that the articulation can never equal the original thought, right? And so there's an irreducible tension, and because of this irreducible tension, you can make that ashot to try to interpret the articulation, and it's in those derashot that you have the or those interpretations that you have the Torah shebe'al peh. Rather than suppress that tension or pursue the insane game in search of the absent book. So, one possibility is say, no, we're going to have the perush of the Torah shebichtav, and this is the final and only perush of the Torah shebichtav. So that's one possibility, because the Library of Babel talks about finding the secret book, which explains all the other books, right? Um, but the Hachamim, rather, we have derashot in Shiv'im Panim LaTorah, and the tension is irreducible. And therefore there is always a possibility of new interpretations, right? So there is no the interpretation, but there's always be new derashot and new understandings, right? The oral law accepts the tension and the absence of the book as a constant, right? Its object is to formulate the tension and explain the absence. I'm not going to gloss over this. I think I'm going to explain this in in greater depth because I think it's worth the effort. Otherwise, you really don't understand what this is about. So let's go back to Borges' story, The Library of Babel, which contains every possible book with every possible arrangement of letters, words, and symbols. Theoretically, in the library, it's an infinite library, so there should exist a book that explains or decodes all the other books. Right? However, because the library is infinite and chaotic, the search for such a book is essentially futile. So the absence of a definitive, all-explaining text creates a paradox. The possibility of complete understanding exists, yet it remains unreachable. So yes, there is the oraculum, right? Go find it. So so now let's go to post-structuralism. So let's say in works of, like, let's say Jacques Derrida. So in Jacques Derrida, in post-structuralist thinking, meaning is never fully present. It's always deferred through an endless chain of interpretations. So in post-structuralism, there's a focus on the absence of a fixed center or ultimate foundation of meaning. Jacques Derrida uses the French term différence, coined to express that meaning is always in flux and is generated through the differences between words, signs, or text. So there's no ultimate text or meaning that explains everything, right? So that's the idea in post-structuralism. It's a little different than Borges. I think in Jacques Derrida, and I could be wrong, but I think in Jacques Derrida, there is no ultimate meaning. I think that's where the post-structuralists went a little crazy, and they just went over the deep end. Whereas in Borges, there is this book. We have to try to look for it, and maybe we'll find something close to it. So we strive to it. So the book exists. It's very difficult to find. Whereas in the post-structuralist, and my sense is that they don't believe in some ultimate fixed meaning. But that's the absence. So you have the idea of the absence. So you have the absence of a singular authoritative book. or center of meaning, right? And therefore, we have the proliferation of interpretation, right? So this absence becomes productive. It opens up the possibility for endless reading, for endless reinterpretation, for endless shifting meanings, or if I can use one word, derashot. So the absence of the book, allows for derashot on the book. That we have the book, which is the Torah. We just don't have the ultimate, because the Torah is the articulation of the oraculum. So we need the other book to sort of define the Torah in terms of the oraculum, or bring it close to the oraculum, right? Or make it equal to the oraculum. Well, you can't. So this opens up the possibility of endless reading, right? The lack of a final true interpretation. So this reflects the post-structuralist rejection of stable universal truths. I just would, again, in the context, I like Borges more than the post-structuralists, because for Borges, there is a stable universal truth. It's just almost impossible to get to, but you're striving to get there, and that's what the derashot do. And for the post-structuralists, again, I don't know, men are women, and women are chickens, and chickens are, table, whatever. It becomes. Perhaps I'm exaggerating, but it becomes a little ludicrous, right? So we know that the post-structuralists really take this to a place which leads to a ludicrous worldview. Anyway, the meaning is always constructed in context and through difference, not through a definitive or absolute source. That's the important thing. So Borges' library, let's get back to that, is a metaphor for the kind of infinite deferral of meaning that the post-structuralists describe. The unattainable book, it represents the elusive total understanding that remains forever out of reach. So that's now we can go back to what my father is writing. Rather than suppress that tension or pursue the insane game in search of the absent book, which eventually could reduce the oraculum to articulation, the oral law accepts the tension and the absence of the book. It's precisely the absence of the book that can reduce the oraculum to articulation and make them equal. The absence of that book is what allows derashot on the R1 book, which is the Tanakh. Right? Its object is to formulate the object of derashot, or Torah shebe'al peh. The object of Torah shebe'al peh is to formulate the tension and explain the absence. That is to be a commentary, right? So through the Torah shebe'al peh, we can approach the book and we accept the tension between oraculum and articulation. And that's why if you go back to the beginning of my father's book, so the book, the Tanakh, is like the solid stone. It never changes. And of course, we know the stone is not equal to the oraculum, but we can smash the stone with a hammer and can create the interaction between the hammer and the stone can create an infinite array of sparks and more sparks and more sparks, and it can never end. So that's the Torah shebe'al peh. That's the derashot. The derashot is hitting the stone, and the Torah shebe'al peh is the interpretations that come out. Applying a legal category whereby certain classes of obligations cannot be contracted in a written document, the rabbis declare that the oral law is unwritable. Lo nitena lehikatev. So there are some types of obligations that have the status of an oral obligation. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because oral obligations, for example, if somebody makes a loan to me, doesn't write it down, and then not me, but somebody makes a loan to somebody else, and the debtor doesn't pay back the loan. If it's an oral loan, it's more difficult to recoup the loan from the properties of the debtor, whereas a written obligation creates a lien. So that's when we need to know the difference in a lien on the property of the debtor. I'm sorry. So there's the bottom line is here that there was a difference in the treatment, in the legal treatment of written obligations, written debts versus oral debts. So in that context, the Hachamim say that the Torah שבעל פה, לא ניתנה להיכתב. Right, the oral law lo ניתנה להיכתב. It does not have the status of a written document. This does not mean that putting it in writing is forbidden, as many people say. דברים שבעל פה אי אתה רשאי לאומם בכתב. So they say you can't write down the Torah שבעל פה. And then they have a question, how did Ben Kadosh write down the Mishnayot? It's writing down, and it's Torah שבעל פה, and that whole thing. So that question for us is not pertinent. Rather, it means that even when reducing to writing, it has the status of an oral formula. What it means is that even if you write it down, it still has the status of an oral text and not a written text. That's what it means. That's the omek. So even though Rabbeinu HaKadosh wrote the Mishnayot don't have the status of the Torah Shebichtav, right? Concerning this type of written documentation, the Talmud explicitly declared that it is to be considered speech, amira. And there are certain types of debt that even if they are written down, they still have the status of an amira, of an oral obligation, notwithstanding that it was written. That's really fascinating. We have seen that certain types of obligations have the status of written because they are writable, although they were not actually written. For example, if a person doesn't write a ketuvah for his wife, the obligations of the ketuvah still apply and will have the status of a written obligation. And therefore, the wife would be able to go to the husband's assets, let's say, and recoup her loan, or at least real estate assets or chattel, as it were, depending. Right, so that's an example of a written obligation that even though it's not actually physically written, it's still treated as a written obligation. Other types of obligations that to be treated as oral, although they were contracted in a written document. So that's a fascinating idea. Example of this obligation that even though it's written down, since enonitan likatev, it has the status of an oral loan, is, for example, and this is born in Masechet Ketuvot Chof Bet, in the case of parents that before, so their children are going to get married, and before the wedding, they write down, even though they write down, we will help you with with the wedding, right? So since this is enonitan likatev, it has the status of an oral obligation. Let's finish this paragraph. Right, a semiotic relationship whereby the oral law is the interpreter and the interpreted system prevails between written and the oral law. This type of relationship cannot be reversed. The interpreter, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, cannot be interpreted in terms of the interpreted system. Very interesting. You can interpret the Torah Shebichtav in terms of the Torah Shebe'al Peh. You can say, Torah Shebichtav says tefillin. I can't inverse the relationship and say, what is tefillin? Tefillin is an alt. Meaning, when the word tefillin appears, I can't use the word ot to interpret the word tefillin, or whatever the case may be. Language alone, because of its mirror-like quality, can be interpreted in terms of itself, right? The oral, footnote 18, okay. The oral character, we spoke about that before, how language is self-reflective, right? It's self-reflective, and therefore can be interpreted in terms of itself. Right? Remember the mirrors of Borges. The oral character of the commentary of Scripture means, first of all, that it is unwritable. So Torah Shebe'al Peh never has the status of a writing. Therefore, it cannot be interpreted in terms of biblical exegesis. The Rasha cannot be applied to the oral law. So, for example, I can make the Rashot to the Pesukim. I can't make the Rashot on the Mishnayot. Secondly, as a result of the preceding like language, the commentary must be explained in terms of itself. right? And that's why you need, I believe the term was talkid, right? The commentary can be self-reflective. It can't be interpreted. What does this Mishnah mean? Look at the pasuk and we'll interpret the Mishnah in the pasuk. No, you need somebody to explain to you the Mishnah. And once somebody explains to you the Mishnah, you can understand the Mishnah. And maybe you can understand the pasuk in terms of the Mishnah, but not the other way around. I will stop here.